First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the spirit of the lands that we've all gathered on and respectfully honour their traditional custodians, the Turrbal, Yagara and Gubbi Gubbi people and their elders, past, present and emerging. Yinjamara to all. I would welcome you all here this afternoon to the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland's general meeting with Dr. Indrani Ganguly. Welcome to you all. Dr. Ganguly was born in Lucknow, India, to Bengali parents. She studied English honours and sociology in India before completing her PhD at the Australian National University on the impact of British occupation on revolution and reform in West Bengal. Indrani is also the author of the wonderful historical novel The Rose and the Thorn, set around the period of time of independence, if I'm correct, am I, Indrani, of India from the British. And she is here to speak to us this afternoon on female characters in historical novels. And before Indrani begins, I might just point out to everybody that we are recording this meeting. And it will be available for those of you who can't make it and for those of you who wish to catch up again later on our site. Welcome, Indrani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I'd really be happier with the same basis, rather. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, elders past, present, and emerging. Any elders in the audience, and also three very special elders in my own family. They are my father and my maternal grandfather and maternal grandmother. Can people hear me? I'm not very au fait with Zoom, so speaking on Zoom, so if I look a bit phased, it's simply because...
I can hear you perfectly, so everybody should be able to use their little response thumb up or clap, and if anybody cannot, please place it in the chat file. So
I should start by saying I'm not the expert on female characters, but I've always been fascinated by how female characters are portrayed in historical novels. And so I think I was talking about it, and one of my writer friends said, well, why don't you do a presentation and tell us what you think and what you've discovered on your own journey. So that's how the idea of doing this presentation came about, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can on this. And so if we can just move on to the first slide, and that's really what I aim to cover. I should say that all the slides are also available, so if people want the slides as well, I've given them to Jim. And I thought we'd start by really looking at what exactly is historical fiction and how is historical fiction different from historical novels? What are the hallmarks of good historical novels? I've limited it to historical development in the East because otherwise we could go on forever if we went around the globe. Thought we'd have a quick look at what are the types of historical novels in the West. Look at female characters in novels written by men, but mostly female characters in historical novels written by women, because I'm a woman and my work centers around the female characters. What's been my personal journey? I'd also like to share a couple of useful resources that I came up on, which may be of interest to you, and I've certainly found them very useful, and then we'll move on to some questions. So very quickly, looking at what exactly is historical fiction. Very simple definition is that it is an imaginary story during an actual time in history, and it has to be set at least 50 years or more before it, when the person is writing it. So it is created and written by someone who was not alive at the time of those events and who therefore approaches them only by research. The characters themselves may be actual historic figures, and the personalities and the behavior of the characters can be based on research, but the conversations and the thoughts attributed to these figures are the author's creation. So that's where the history and the fiction converge. Look at historical fiction versus historical novels, and this was a distinction I myself wasn't aware of till I started digging into the genre. And although that historical fiction is often used interchangeably with historical novel, it can actually also be applied to various other forms of narrative, which is theater, opera, cinema and television, video games, and graphic novels. But I'm going to restrict myself to the historical novel with a specific focus on female characters in historical novels written by women, especially Australians. Historical novels are a very wide genre, but there are some hallmarks that have to be in every work. For one thing, the books must exhibit a high level of writing. They could be literary even, so not pulp fiction. Historical fiction is not pulp fiction, good historical fiction. The setting is a real slice of history. It's not a made-up period. The fictional characters can interact with real characters and events, and the historical timeline needs to be absolutely correct. And we've all come across boo-boos in works even by famous authors, like Shakespeare had a clock ticking in Julius Caesar. Clocks hadn't been invented at that period of time, so he could get away with it. Most of us can't. The plot may be focused on the fictional characters, but it is intertwined with real events in an in-depth, complicated yet seamless way. So it has to really blend into, they have to blend into each other. And the fictional characters are so well drawn and integrated into history that the character almost believes they are real. And ideally, at the end of the novel, the reader wants more of the story. And during and after reading the novel, the reader does more research of actual historical events because her curiosity or his curiosity has been piqued, and she isn't ready to let the novel end. And I was looking at some of the reviews on Goodreads, and some people actually did go and do that. So I think I'll take it as a hallmark. Looking at historical novel development in the West might actually surprise us to learn that at one time novels were considered frivolous and even subversive. I've got some quotes up there. Novel reading cascades people into useless outcomes, obsesses them with unnecessary passions while providing a distorted view of life. And in the days of my youth, fiction was regarded a very dangerous reading, especially for young people. The novel and the theatre were placed on the same level. Both were of the devil, and consequently both were to be shunned. There might be a few people who still think that, but hopefully not too many. Now, historical development in the West, the historical novels actually developed from the Romantic movement in the 19th century as it appealed to the desire to escape from the present. Some of it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which brought in a lot of benefits, but also created a lot of angst and hardship for people uprooted from their lands, plunged into the factory scenario, or people who just didn't want to move on. And the historical novel changed the perception of novels being frivolous, read only by frivolous women. And by skillfully mixing historical references, sketches of local customs, manners, scenes of adventure, family sagas, as well as love stories in which national and personal fate coincided, the historical novel generated a new reading public that comprised both sexes more evenly, and it broke down the gender division in readership. Men also liked not only writing, but reading historical novels. And finally, by focusing on grand topics such as revolutionary wars or key conflicts in a nation's history, the novel could be elevated to the rank of a modern epic that depicted the formation of a nation and captured the soul of its people. So historical novels today have changed a bit in that they attempt to assess and understand the past rather than to glorify it. And they fill gaps for the readers such as political and social history, customs, psychological attitudes, states of science and technology at a particular point in time or over a period. And I'm just going to briefly discuss female characters in historical fiction written by men, and then focus on the many kinds of historical fiction written by women. Today, there are several kinds of historical novels with female characters in books written by both men and women. The International Association of Professional Writers and Editors identifies about 10 different types of historical novels. I'm not going to go into detail into these at this point of time. We'll come back with some real life examples. And so I'll go on to the definitions and examples as part of the discussion of female characters in historical novels written by women. Very brief look at female characters in novels written by men. So male writers of historical novels have often been critiqued as portraying their female characters in very stereotypical terms. The women are often negative characters, at best passive or secondary, subservient to the male characters. But sometimes the negative characters are great fictional characters, and some of you may be familiar, maybe all of you are, with Tale of Two Cities, where we have Madame Defarge sitting and knitting the names of the enemies as the heads roll. Maybe that's why I never liked knitting, but you know, the knit pearl as the heads roll. And some of the more sensitive portrayals of women in historical novels by men, I just picked out 3. There are others. These stuck in my mind. One was The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Hawthorne is not noted for his sympathetic attitudes to either readers or people who weren't in the strict Christian tradition that he was born into and practiced. Now, it's set in puritanical USA and in Massachusetts, and it tells the story of a young woman, Hester Prynne, who transcends boundaries by having a relationship with someone to whom she was not married. She gets pregnant. She's duly punished. She has to wear the scarlet letter A on her shoulder. But it's actually told quite sympathetically. And at the end of it, she does overcome all the trials and tribulations. But she retains that red letter as a symbol of defiance, of courage and resilience. And she then sets an example to other young women seeking to escape the barriers they faced in those times. The second one is A Fringe of Leaves by our Australian writer, Patrick White. Now, White has been critiqued quite correctly for his portrayal of Aboriginal people in that book. I think he has them as cannibals. They were not cannibals. But it is, again, quite a sensitively written story of Eliza Fraser, who comes from a working class background, is married to someone from a middle class background, comes from Britain to Australia. So she's transcending the barriers of geography, class, gender. She gets shipwrecked, and then she is rescued by a group of Aboriginal people. At the end of it, she comes back to her own society, and I think she kind of thinks that, is this really civilization that I've come back to? And the whole story is told from a very sympathetic view, and it's based on a real story of what would this woman have gone through through these experiences. The last one's a pretty well-known book, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, and it's again a compassionate, it's a male over voice, death is a male, but it is the story of a young girl during the Nazi era when books were banned, and during World War II, and she steals books, hence the book thief, and she learns to read, and she finds comfort in words. And she and Max, the Jew her family protects, are the only people who survive that ordeal, but they're the only characters that survive the war. But again, another very sympathetically depicted female character by a male author. I'll move on to the women. Now, I just thought it was quite interesting to see why the women authors actually wrote fiction. And if you've been through the conventional history classes, which was about battles and wars fought by men, it was studying history in school was not real to me, as it entailed memorizing a lot of dates and facts. The story was missing. Now I have learned to envision the story behind the facts and love to read actual history books. Weaving my own stories around those facts is a delight. And this is by Elaine Koffler, who's an American author. And I rather liked that because that was my feeling about the kind of history we were taught in schools. Now, not all historical novels written by women have females as their dominant characters. For example, we have Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, which is about Thomas Cromwell. We have Eleanor Dark's The Timeless Land and Grenville's The Secret River, which is about Lieutenant MacArthur. But they are great historical novels, but not with women. So, but I thought we'd focus on the female characters in historical novels written by women. Thought I'd share with you why women writers write historical fiction and how they do it. So I thought we'd go back to our very own Kate Grenville. And she says, I have always been interested in giving voice to women who've been silenced. And I'll come back to one of her books later. Megan O'Grady, who's an American author, echoes Kate's feelings. She said, if history belongs to the victors, it's generally fallen to everyone else, the women, the colonized or enslaved, those on the other side of wars and walls, to subvert conventional understanding of it, to make up for the burnt or redacted documents, the missing transcripts, and the experiences that were never recorded in the first place. And sometimes it changes the writer's own perception of the lead character. And here's Kate Grenville talking about her latest book, A Room Made of Leaves. People seen it? Well, it probably isn't showing up here, but she started off with saying that Elizabeth MacArthur thought she was a great woman. She's keeping up this giant sheep industry. But when she was reading it, she thought, before she started the work, she thought Elizabeth MacArthur was actually quite a boring woman. But then she read her diaries, and there was a really good interview with Kate. And as she read the diary, Elizabeth MacArthur came to life for her, and then she ended up writing this book. And she said, when I read those 5 words, I blush at my error. This sort of abstract silhouette of a woman, this distant, half-seen woman suddenly sprang to life. And that was a bit of my own experience, but I'll come back. Now, there are some safeguards to be remembered while we're writing historical fiction. And Hilary Mantel, who has been awarded the Booker Prize twice, says that women writers can't resist retrospectively empowering women of the past in historical fiction. And she says, if we write about the victims of history, are we reinforcing their status by detailing it? Or are we reworking history so victims are the winners? If we just move on, and that's something to think about. How are we actually depicting the women when we go back in time? Now, Greer McAllister, another American author who's actually written fictionalized novels about the first female detective in Pinkerton's, the famous American detective agency. And she said, this is a false choice. Any historical novel worth its salt has to address society's expectations of women at the time in which it's set. So some authors focus on ordinary women, some on extraordinary ones. Both options offer countless possibilities for advancing or contradicting feminist viewpoints. But knowing one's time period is absolutely essential, no matter what. A historical novel in which women play key roles doesn't resonate unless the author can faithfully and honestly depict ordinary men and ordinary women of that time. And Joanna Courtney, who has rewritten the story of women in Shakespeare's tragedies, including Lady Macbeth and Ophelia, and they're very clever, very imaginative books. She says, look, let's draw on the core traits of being human and of being a woman. Childbirth is a prime example. Yes, a laboring woman was in more danger in previous times, but in a normal birth, very little inside her own body and head would have been different to how it is now. And as with all fiction, it comes to knowing our heroine inside out. We must research all we can about what makes her different from us, what she would have worn, how she would have washed, arranged her hair, cooked or instructed others to cook. But then we must explore all the things that make her the same as us, how she feels about her life, what scares her, what thrills her, who she loves. Only once we know all this can we inhabit her world and create her story. So you really have to get inside the author, the character's head, the body, and what she's feeling to make it authentic and believable. Might move on to female characters in historical novels written by women. Um, Best known are perhaps the traditional historical novels, and this typically has a historically accurate plot. Very well known Colleen McCullough's Masters of Rome series, mostly about the men, but it's only in volume 4, Caesar's Women, that we get an expose of the important women in Caesar's life, his mother, his lover, his daughter, and his 2 wives. And again, Colleen McCullough is a master storyteller. So this is a really good one. Romola is a historical novel by George Eliot. I think she was called Mary Ann Evans in real life, but she had a male name to be able to sell her books. And that's set in the 15th century. And it's a study of the city of Florence from an intellectual, artistic, religious, and social point of view. And it takes place amidst actual historical events during the Italian Renaissance and includes in its plot several notable figures from Florentine history. And this was a very different kind of novel for George Eliot, because I remember reading Middlemarch, which wasn't a historical novel. Now, Gone with the Wind, it's been involved in a lot of controversy in recent times. It's now not considered historical fiction, as it glosses over the cruelties of slavery in the American Deep South. They weren't all happy mammies, dealing with white prodigies. So now it's put under the genre of historical romance, because it was a great story. I mean, there were aspects of it which are really well done. I won't go into too much detail of each of these, but we have the multi-period epic series and sagas, and they show how a specific place, geographic area, or cultural ethnic groups change over time. And they tend to be long books or multiple volumes. And again, coming back to Colleen McCullough's The Thornbirds, that's a chronicle of 3 generations of Clearys. And we have the 3 major characters, Fiona, Maggie, and Justine. They show different attitudes to life. Women have subordinate social status and sinful images in Christianity. And facing the male and religion-oriented society, all of them behave as brave, self-respectful, and forceful women to conquer the miserable condition. And central to that is, of course, the story of Cleary's only daughter, Maggie, and the priest, Father Ralph de Bricassat. Historical romantic novel. This was how I got introduced to historical fiction. So I chose Georgette Hare because she was one of my favorites when I was in high school. One of the few not light-hearted fiction the nuns actually didn't mind. They didn't like Mills and Boon. Anyone here familiar with Georgette Hare? Did you read all the Regency romances? Oh, we loved them. And most of them about swashbuckling men going off to save women. But there was one, The Masqueraders, where there's a woman disguised as a man carrying a sword. But we really liked the Grand Sophie, and she's a delightful character. She's 5'9" in her stockings and quite used to getting her own way. Her mother has passed away. She has no governess. She has wartime liberty. She's outgoing, chic, and quite independent. And she really shocks her very, very conventional cousin Charles, and she comes to live with their family. And if you get the chance, have a look at it. It's really good fun. But Georgette Hare is very good in that she does a lot of research. So all the context is very well, thoroughly researched and quite authentic. So she's got this fictional character, but everything is as it would have happened. Now, Australian historical novels are often called settler romances, as many Australian folk writers focus on relationships between women and convicts or women growing up in dysfunctional families, rather dark kind of fiction. And there is a lot of emphasis on the bush forming the character of the Australian girl, whatever the Australian girl is. Now, when women write it, they differ in an important and significant ways from other Australian literature of the period, where a lot of colonial literature has represented women as being out of place in the Australian bush or frontier region. It's an kind of echo of the old belief that the empire was no place for a white woman. However, early Australian romance novels celebrate and validate women's place in the book. I came across Marie Bielki Peterson's Jeweled Nights, where the heroine cross-dresses as a young man in order to restore her family fortunes by engaging in mining activities in Tasmania, where she proves to be a far more successful miner than the other men. Now, this might have been slightly wishful thinking, but she wrote it. Historical Western novels, generally known as the Cowboys and Indians, and they're a kind of outdated genre in terms of how they depict Indigenous people. But in Australia, it usually refers to stories about the early settlers' life in the outback. And as I said, it is a controversial genre now because it stereotypes both the white settler and the Indigenous peoples who were displaced. And in Australia, this often overlaps with the historical romances set in the bush. All That Swagger by Miles Franklin is one of the best known in this genre, and I think she is such a great writer again. And Franklin conveys the oppression of the isolation the female lead character, Johanna de Lacy, endures and captures. And Johanna's fear of the Australian bush is really well depicted, but she's not a flat one-dimensional character. She is heroic, but she is also very class-conscious. She's fearful of scandal and often interrupts her husband's doing, where she thinks he's transgressing the boundaries and the repercussions that would have on them and their family. So again, quite true to life set in that period. Mysteries, thrillers, and adventure novels. Now, who here hasn't read Friday Fisher's Exploits or seen the movies? That is such a great one. And Friday Fisher, well, and that was again quite a realistically depicted context because she came into prominence after the Great War when a lot of men had gone to war, had never returned or had been injured, and women had a lot of opportunities to go out and work in the jobs vacated by the men. And many women didn't marry because there just weren't enough men around, or they just got used to being independent. Now, Friday joined the war driving an ambulance, and she developed a taste for having a life unhampered by men. She was very lucky to also inherit a lot of money. Not all the women would have been that, and she wasn't aware of the Depression and the Second World War. And because she had had a hard life growing up, she was also quite empathetic towards others who weren't quite so fortunate. So yes, she has beautiful clothes, she has beautiful home, she drives these snazzy cars, has all these, romantic relationships. I'm not quite sure about that inspector in the stories, but that is one of the best known historical thriller. But Alias Grace is by Margaret Atwood. People familiar? I'm sure you are with Margaret Atwood, Handmaid's Tale, which is a futuristic story. And this is based on a real story of a servant, Grace, who is accused of killing her employer and his housekeeper, who was her lover. She is a very complex figure, again, not totally black or white. And it's told through the eyes of a doctor who comes to hear about Grace, who's in prison. And I won't go into the story because that gives away a lot of the secrets, but it remains very ambiguous, but again, quite true. And as Margaret Atwood says, the true character of the historical Grace Marks remains an enigma And she's remained quite true to her sources because she hasn't come up with any neat ending. She doesn't have the resources or the sources to have the neat ending, and that's how it was in real life. Time travel. That's very in, I think, at the moment. And generally they focus Doctor Who. Any Doctor Who fans here? No? Time travel, it focuses on the consequences of traveling into the past or the future, but they also often offer some kind of a social commentary, as time travel provides a necessary distancing effect that allows science fiction to address contemporary issues in metaphorical ways. And here, one of the best known books is The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Nepanega. People familiar with that? And it's a slightly sad science fiction metaphor for women who love men who can't commit to relationships and who think women are less capable of handling life's problems than themselves. You know, if you go to the end, it's the wife reflecting on all that happened with her husband who whizzed in and out of her life. A very different one that I reread recently is The Shining Girls, because I like crime fiction as well. I don't write it. And it's a historical time travel thriller. It's the story of a time traveling serial killer who is impossible to trace until one of his victims survives. And it's set in Depression era Chicago. The guy, Harper Curtis, he finds the key to a house that opens onto other times. But the only way he can keep traveling back and forth is he has to kill the shining girls, bright young women burning with potential, and he stalks them until one of his victims, Kirby Mazrachi, who takes up a job as a journalist, starts, she survives through a miracle, and she starts hunting him back. Again, very imaginative, I thought, quite different from a lot of time travel stories. And of course, a lot of it is told through the eyes of Kirby. Now, alternate history is a bit of wishful thinking. It's if women had been in power, how would life be? And I found one. There are others. The Ash, A Secret History in an Alternate Middle Ages, where we have a female captain of mercenaries. She travels through Europe and the Middle East, trying to prevent an invasion of Europe by a Carthaginian army. Now, this character is again quite realistic, because even though she is strong, intelligent, in command of her troops, but she can be quite brutal as well. You cannot command an enemy by being the nice girl. And so, fantasy. Anyone familiar with the Arthurian Legends, Camelot? Now, this is in which Morgan Le Fay, the sister of Arthur, is this evil witch. In the midst of Avalon, she's actually the wise woman. And if we think back to history, witches were wise women that the church and the doctors didn't like. So Morgan Le Fay is the wise woman in the midst of Avalon. She is a healer who is then cast as the villain. And in this, she is again a complex character. She's very powerful, very independent, but she can be quite destructive as well. Again, a great read. Literary novels. This is a slightly ambiguous, because it can really category, because it can overlap with a lot of other categories. And I just mentioned A Room Made of Leaves by Kate Grenville, which has just come out. I'm just got it from the library, so I'm going to start reading it. Anyone read it? Has anyone read Kate? Well, might be next read for you. And the last one is the Christian novels, which I found one example, Christie. That's a Christian historical fiction. It's set in the fictional Appalachian village of Cutter Gap, and it looks at the interaction of faith, Christian faith, and mountain traditions such as moonshining, folk beliefs, and folk medicine. And it was inspired by the work of Marshall's mother, Leonora, who taught impoverished children in this region when she was a young single woman. So people, you know, going into a bit of their own personal lives as well, a way of, I don't know, catharsis, I guess.
A way of sharing their story.
Yes.
So Indrani, that's that brings us to the first section. And while you catch your breath and take a drink, let me start first of all by just pulling out that whole idea of the story that you just said. The history often neglects. You also drew out the idea in historical fiction of not only the story but the character and their setting, in other words, their time period, and being faithful to all of that. Would you like to just expand on that just a little bit?
Yes, well, you couldn't have a 21st century woman in the 19th century. Shall we say Julia Gillard would not have been the Prime Minister of Australia if in that period. So if, yes, Elizabeth I was the Queen, but she remained Queen and in control because she chose not to marry, and just through an accident of birth. You know, there were no male heirs. You could, so you have to look at what happened in that time. But there were strong women. Sometimes, a lot of the time, the power was not formal power, so it wasn't recognized in the legislation and the time by the church or the press or whatever, but they had a lot of informal power, and you have to delve into history to understand that.
And certainly your reference there to Marion Zimmer Bradley's books on the Mists of Avalon and others of the Arthur's legend, certainly women in that period of time also.
I'm not sure who wrote the Bible and made Eve the
Yes. Oh, we could go into quite a history here. Questions from our audience, please. Could we, if you have a question, either just wave at me or just unmute yourself and go ahead. I'll be quiet now and let somebody ask a question.
Just comment really with the looking at back at history and the older books written back in the day by women or men. These days, there seems to be, and only probably recently, in the last 10 years, there seems to be a move afoot right around the world to judge history by our standards today. I think it's a huge mistake to let that go forward, because all you succeed in doing is trying to change history, really. It's how people lived in those days. It's how, you know, we look back and say, how dare they treat those women like that? Where in actual fact, possibly at least half of those women liked that life that they had. They wanted to stay home and look after the house and the farm and things like that. It's yeah, I think it's just and it's only a statement. I think it's just a mistake to try and, you know, get rid of Gone with the Wind, for instance, as a historical novel and call it historical romance. I'm not sure that that's true. It's a romance, there's no doubt. But again, if you research, you'll find that quite a lot of the slaves, particularly the second generations, were quite happy with their lot. Not saying it was a great thing, it's a terrible thing, but you know, they were happy slaves, and so as a, you know, we've got to be careful with our literature, really. We don't want to cancel culture our old books.
Indrani, did you want to comment on that, or anybody else?
I don't believe in cancel culture unless it's something really. Yeah, and I agree with you that, but ultimately history is whose history, and sometimes you uncover new facts. History is always being rewritten.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I
Virginia?
agree. Yeah, no, I agree with that, what Indrani just said, because I think some of the, you know, some of what was written back then was written by men in the church. And when you do better research, and it doesn't even have to be hard research, sometimes you discover that what was written wasn't true anyway. And so,
Yeah, well, yeah, winners.
You know what I mean? You can rewrite history in the way it really was, not the way that the church tried to tell us that it was.
Well,
But they're the worst.
that's
of all,
true. That's true.
you know, of
Winners write history.
so
And
yeah,
also, there's another little bit in there about Patrick White and having a go at him about saying that
his misinterpretation of the culture is what you're referring to.
well, I'm referring to that people say that I've seen plenty of, and I've researched quite a bit for different things I've written on Aboriginal culture, and some of them were cannibals. There's absolutely no doubt about it. They didn't do it as a natural, that's what we eat thing, but they did, for different cultural reasons, eat their enemies and cook their enemies. And
there were some parts of the body that are considered to be powerful. It's exactly the same as the American Indian belief. There was I think the liver is considered to be one of the most important
I wasn't
places.
saying that was my point of view about Patrick White. I'm just saying the book was critiqued on that.
yeah, no, Indrani, I understand that.
I'm actually giving him credit for the way he portrayed Eliza Fraser.
Yeah.
Anyway. More readable books as well.
Are there any other questions or comments? Please, is anybody else would like to offer a Lexia?
Yeah, I was talking to Marilyn Hume, who wrote the Arthurian trilogy and Merlin trilogy and things like that. She quite researched it too, but she was saying because she's a woman, they wouldn't publish it under a name. They only published her as M.K. Hume. And then when she did a book signing, the number of men who said, you couldn't have written this, you're a woman, especially the battle scenes, you know, no woman can write a battle scene. So that I don't know what you call it, preconceived ideas are still alive.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So, and it's interesting we can always say that, you know, you hear Chaucer, Shakespeare, all those, they're all males. There's very few females from history. Their writing has survived from history.
I've heard that Shakespeare's was actually written by a woman.
Yes, there's lots
Probably
of those.
they're saying it's to others too.
I'd love to be able to find out if that was real.
You got to laugh at people saying women can't write battle scenes. How many of those writers, male or female, have been in battle? I mean, probably write it just as well as any man who hadn't been in battle.
Well, there was Joan of Arc.
I was just going to say Joan of Arc, Matilda of Canossa. Then we got the Irish.
Boadicea.
They call it Boudica now.
O'Malley, what was his name?
We all learned as Boadicea.
Boadicea.
Boudica is how.
They call it Boudica.
Boudica.
Yeah,
Boudica.
Boudica.
That's
Grace O'Malley, that's the other one. She was a pirate queen.
That's right.
It's interesting when you start talking about history, and if you don't mind, I just might make a comment too, Indrani and Russell, on what you're saying. My degree is actually in history, and I taught history in high schools for about 28 years. And I always used to say to the students that when you look at the word history, it's his story.
Yes.
And to a very large extent, in the Western tradition in particular, that is what it is. It's been written by the victorious males. And I remember when I was at university, the Manning Clark series, History of Australia, was coming out. And there was a lot of criticism from academia of Manning Clark because he had turned the history of Australia into a narrative, a story. He was bringing out characters, and he was actually putting them in situations and explaining. To me, that's what history was all about. It was the story. And it is a story that can, when you start looking at different views of it, can be quite changed. And there's history today that is people are starting to realise that the actual history, especially of our early settlement years, is actually been hidden for well over 200 years, the real story. And it's only really coming out now. So as a historian, I just thought I'd say that.
But
It's not
Jim,
just Western, it's everywhere.
Indrani? Yes, sorry.
It isn't just Western writers,
Right.
it's everywhere.
Yes.
but Jim, you don't even have to go back 200 years. You only have to go back to World War II.
Oh,
There's
yes.
incidents that happen in World War II that will never see the light of day because they were never recorded, and it's only anecdotal
And
evidence. But, you know,
well, look
people
at
are digging it up, but it's very slow process. But
well, there's one very, very simple example is the person who has just been recommended for the award of Victoria Cross. His name escapes me at the moment. He was
Teddy somebody.
he was a
Yeah,
young
that's it.
17-year-old gunner on a ship that went down, and he kept himself at his gun, strapped himself to his gun and stayed there.
Yeah.
He went down with the ship, and he was only ever obliquely mentioned in dispatches at the time because I read that the captain of the ship that went down, when he got back to Darwin as a survivor, was criticised and never had another command all through the war. They blamed him for the simple fact that the Japanese were good enough to shoot him out of the water. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, it's
Are there any
true.
other questions? Yes, Gleneen, please. Gleneen, I can't hear you. There's something, you're not muted, so would you like to write something? Let me just have a look over here on the side. Gleneen, if you can see the chat
I'm
side.
unmuted, I think, now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Sorry,
Thank you.
another technical challenge.
Jennifer.
Yes, I was delayed because of numerous technical challenges. So I'm sorry, Indrani, I missed your earlier slides, but I'm very pleased it's recorded. So I'll be able to listen again. I did see quite a few books that I've read and enjoyed. So it was really very interesting to hear from them, hear about those books and the characters from a different perspective. So thank you for that. And I'd just like to add something to your conversation about the different versions of history. Due to some historical research that I was involved in, I actually looked up some of my family records down at the State Archives, and in our family we have an oral history tradition, if you like, about what happened to my father's grandfather, how he died, when he died, and so on, and it's sort of been handed down, and I'd heard that story. But then I went to the State Archives and I got a very different story, and the part that was so different was from a letter written by this man's wife. So because I thought my 40-odd cousins might be interested in that sort of land history, I sent out, they all know the oral history version, and so I gave them the other version, and it was really a bit of a land history, and only one of the people I emailed responded, and he said it was interesting, and I had to phone one of the other people before I sent it out, and I knew that of the people who might be unhappy to hear the new version or the other version, I knew he was one of them, and he was very unhappy to hear that there was a different version of history. Yeah. So it can have, I mean, and whose story is right anyway? Did the wife tell a particular story for a particular reason? Or, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Who tells the story? And yeah,
it is, Jennifer, and it's why a lot of historians, when they look at primary sources like that, they really have to rely on a broad range of primary sources that come from the time. Has anybody else had that experience? My family is exactly the same. I had an experience researching my family. I've discovered things that when my uncle did a family genealogy in the 1980s, he rejected certain facts that I found. Has anybody else had that experience?
Anyone who's read the Bible.
That could be the case, yes.
Oh well, you know, when you see the Dead Sea Scrolls and all those sorts of things, it's history. People can't help themselves. They got to embellish.
The other thing, and it goes exactly to what Russell you were saying earlier, is that the point of view of the person looking at the history is often what colours the perception of that. Verity, do you want to just add to that?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say about when people were doing my family history, they had all the male names like Joseph, John, and Mark or whatever, and 3 girls. So for all the family, it was all just the male names. And so when we were over in England one time, we went to the Irish Genealogical Society, and we were very excited to be able to actually add all the female names to the family tree, because the women were just plus 3 females.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, they weren't important.
Yeah. It's the man and his whoever is his attendant.
The man and his sons. That's right.
It wasn't that long ago either, Verity. I mean,
No.
When women weren't allowed to own property and those sorts of things,
that's right.
It's still in memory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there's no further questions of this, Indrani, you're going on to talk about your specific experience in writing The Rose and the Thorn. Am I correct?
Yes, some of you have already read it.
Indeed.
Not everyone, but I just thought, and bear with me because you will have heard me speak about it at the book launch. That's the book. And I'll show you where I didn't put this on a slide. Can people see this? Can you put me on speaker view, Jim? Then it's a bit easy. If you put me on speaker view.
Yep.
I've put you on speaker view, but I think what everybody does is have to do that for their own settings on their own device, their own computer.
I've put mine on speaker view. I was trying to show this book.
You hold it up.
Hold it up.
Yeah, hold it up higher.
Yep.
Cover your face.
Just
Put it over your face.
Straight in front of your face. That's it. The social history of a Bengal town.
Yeah. And I thought I didn't talk about this at the launch, so I'll go back to, this was where it all started when I was doing my, are people happy to get a bit of background?
Please.
Doing the history of, this is the town my mother's family comes from, and I always thought of it as being this rather boring provincial town where I was obliged to spend my summer holidays. I mean, it was fun with, and then when I came to the ANU, my professor said, look, no one's written on these small towns. Everyone goes to the big cities. You've got a great advantage that you actually know the language and you know somebody in the city. So you can do a bit of oral history along with the. So I went and then discovered all kinds of things that I didn't know about the city. So it wasn't about my family per se, but it was about a town that featured very prominently as part of my growing up. And doing that research really sowed the seeds of the novel, because the research was set in the period 1900 to 1947, which is when the Indian movement really revved up. And there were quite a few women who came onto this scene, but all I could find was information about the high flyers, who then, Indira Gandhi is probably the best known. But there was nothing about the so-called ordinary women like my grandmother, and that's the first time I learned that she'd been involved in the national movement and in social reform in her own little way. So, but I couldn't put it in the thesis because I had to have something to validate. It couldn't be one person saying I did this. But I had it tucked away at the back of my head. And many years later, then I thought, oh, well, I can do historical fiction. I can use my research background to provide an accurate context, but I can create the characters. And so that's how it came up with The Rose and the Thorn.
Excellent. Did you want to go to the next one? Is that?
It's well, it's really a summary of what the book is about, and I thought I'd look at it from the point of view of three young girls. Two were Indian and they were twins. And I also included a young English woman, and this is based on my grandmother's story about some of the friendships, because it wasn't always, Brits here and Indians here. There were some friendships that transcended the barriers of race and the history. And it's set in the city of Lucknow, which is where I was born, and another fictional town which doesn't exist. And a lot of it was, how were these ordinary women drawn into the national movement? They were all educated young girls, but of course had to listen to their adults about, how far they could study, who they would marry, where they would live. And I just thought, let's see what happened. What were the strengths that they drew from their own culture and background? And the English women were just as were quite constrained by their own cultures as the Indians. So, that's how it, and let's make it a friendship between the three girls. They all go their different ways, but then they come together again. And that took quite a bit of researching, because I knew how the Indian girls would have grown up from my great-grandmother was still alive when, but the English girls, again, we only read about the viceroy's wife or, the governor's wife. We didn't know what the ordinary English women lived like. And the state library here was pretty handy. I learned all kinds of things about the women of the Raj that I didn't know about, and I've put some of those in the novel. There was one really interesting anecdote which I put in the novel, and that's when the children and the women were going back home to Britain for holidays, and they had a custom of throwing the hats in the sea. If the hat sank, it meant they didn't have to return. If it floated, it meant they would have to come back to a land where they often didn't feel very comfortable. So some people would put coins in the hat so it sank. So it was all a game. And there were all these little things that I thought made the characters more believable. And but it is all based on what people have written and recorded.
Did you want to talk about the reasons there? Any specific aspect of that reason you want to highlight, Indrani?
Well, the reasons were really, as I said, to highlight the role of the women in the national movement and also social reform, because I think one of the unique things about the nationalist leaders, yes, they didn't want the British there, but they also recognized there were many things in our own societies that needed to be addressed. And again, women were quite involved in the social, looking at barriers women faced, or people from low socioeconomic, again, not recorded in conventional history, but I could put it in a fictionalized form. And the third was, as I said, the relationships between ordinary people of British and Indian heritage. I actually met a couple of British guys who grew up under the Raj and then decided to stay on in the hills of India. And they still, I've read one of their books. So yeah, so it was really recording the ordinary people's lives and histories in a fictionalized form. You can make them do things that you couldn't do in a more formal history book.
So you took 7 years to write it, you said there?
I did say that I'm not a natural, I'm more comfortable with factual writing. I'm not a natural fiction writer. And plus I am fussy about getting the context correct. So in between juggling full-time job and children, but this was a kind of creating my own space. So yes, it took 7 years, and I have acknowledged the Queensland Writer Centres and the Society of Women Writers, where I used to submit chapters, and they would tell me, too many characters, kill a few off, not sticking to a proper time frame, you're going off at a tangent, and that was pretty useful feedback, particularly when it comes from people who don't know the society, so they can pick the gaps in it.
You end up there on that page by saying that you had to dig much deeper to get some insight into the English women's lives. Did you want to expand on that? Yeah.
Yes, as I said, there wasn't much that I knew about the ordinary ordinary English women. No, it was all the high flyers. So, but I wanted to make it as accurate as possible, and that's when I started reading about there is some information now coming out about the women of the Raj, and State Library was really helpful because some of them came from India to Australia.
Yes,
So
my doctor's I had a very good friend in the marketing world. He's since passed, but he and his sister were part of the Raj. He moved out here, but his sister stayed in India, and her son is now my doctor. I didn't have any idea when I picked him up when I moved to Brisbane, but he's very interesting. He even speaks with an Indian lilt. But he's English, and he's fascinating to listen to about that period. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of them are actually going back to India because they have ancestors buried there. There were a lot of wars, or people just died of disease, old age, or something, and the gravestones are still there. So I've met a couple of them. I was very intrigued when I came to West End. There were all these roads with named after Indian rivers, Hooghly, Ganges, Jamuna, and I thought, someone moving from one end of the Raj to the other. And you do have, and that's where I learned Australia also has a town called Lucknow.
That's right. Yes, I grew up and went to school in a town called Orange in central west New South Wales, and there was a little gold mining village just out of Orange called Lucknow. It's nothing like the grand city that you were born in, Indrani. You talk about your challenges there. Can I just ask you to expand a little on that, finding information to back up what you were writing? What sort of research did you have to do? You've mentioned the State Library. They have extensive records, do they?
No, they had some. Some of it I was just drawing on what I could from my historical research. With the dialogue, I just decided I'm not going to try and write like how they might have spoken in those, because then that becomes very artificial. So I just decided, Judy Gregory really said it beautifully. She said, write what feels true to you. And that's what I did. It wasn't difficult to get the facts about the main events because those are all well recorded by both Indian and British historians.
Yes, that's one thing about the British is they're
very good record keepers.
They are very good record keepers, a little bit like the Romans. Please, if anybody has any questions of Indrani at this stage on her journey in writing The Rose and the Thorn, please feel free, jump in.
I've sort of gone a bit all over, but that's basically there, trying to scope it to a manageable level.
So these were, sorry, Russell?
Just on the research, because when I research, my overwhelming source is Google. Did you find much on there? Do you find that rather than libraries?
Not a lot. I tended, because there wasn't a lot on ordinary women. There were bits and pieces, but most of it was library research.
Yeah.
Indra, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great, thanks. Sorry about my technical problems with the mic. Okay. Indra, I'm wondering what the challenges for you were in the editing of your novel. I'm an editor and I'm really interested in that. And I'm thinking when you talk about the dialogue, that would be a challenge for an editor to respect the integrity of that, and also to see, well, where might there need to be some consistency brought in, or something like that, just little things.
Oh, yes. Well, one person said, this is very old-fashioned English, and it doesn't read like Australian English. And I said, well, of course, it's not Australian English, and it's written in the 1900s, 1947. And the reality is most of the characters would not have been speaking in English. They would have, many of them would have been bilingual or multilingual. So they would have been speaking in the first language from the main characters was Bengali, and then they would have learned Hindi because Lucknow is a Hindi. And then some of them would have learned English, and that's how it was in real life. And like most multilingual people, they would have been flitting back and forth between the languages. I didn't put too much of that because I think that detracts from the actual story.
Gleneen has just written something in the chat column. She says, I'm reminded of the fact that for centuries the account of women was not seen as reliable in a legal sense, and I wonder to what extent this was related to initial resistance to women's accounts of history. Would you like to comment on that, Indrani, especially in the light of the relationship between the female characters in your novel to the men who often distrusted their involvement in the national movement, didn't they?
Well, they were both. No, they were actually encouraged. A lot of Gandhi was very supportive. He said he learned the art of passive resistance from his wife. And
interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of them were quite supportive. Not everybody was. So yeah, it was quite a mix. But the national movement really brought a lot of middle-class women out of the homes into the public arena. And that was the training ground for many of them to go on to become politicians. Now, keeping in mind, a lot of these were middle-class educated women. There was very little, even less information about what poor women were, how poor women were involved. So I didn't put too much of that in because I just couldn't find anything.
Anecdotally, were many of the, for want of a better word, the lower caste women in India, were they involved in independence movement, or were they simply involved in a struggle to stay alive?
A lot of them would have been involved in the war effort. They were the women working in factories and things. So that would have been supporting the British war effort. In terms, yes, some of them were. I remember I had that scene in my book too. A group of prostitutes in Kolkata, they had actually wanted to contribute to Gandhi's fundraising, and he said, no, these are funds raised through immoral. But the local Congress vetoed him. They weren't too, and yes, they took the funds from them.
They contributed to the effort.
Yes, not everyone thought Gandhi is this knight in shining armor that Richard Attenborough. Indians were quite aware of his foibles and
eccentricities.
Yes.
We all have feet of clay. Any other questions or comments? So, Indrani, are there in general on historical fiction or the novel, The Rose and the Thorn, that some of
Only
you...
that I've got to read it yet. I haven't read it, and I certainly will, Indrani.
I would highly recommend it.
Yep, definitely recommend it, Russell. It's a fabulous book.
Yeah, no, I certainly will. I've promised myself I will.
Is it in the library, Indrani, your book?
Yes, it's in the Redcliffe and the City Council, Brisbane City Council library.
Okay. Oh, good.
Indrani, do you just want to comment on the novel? The two central characters, Mika and Loki,
Mukti and Leela.
Mukti and Leela.
Yeah.
Did you just want to talk about the real sort of contrast between the two and the way in which that expresses itself in the title, The Rose and the Thorn, the gentleness, the strength,
well, Mukti means freedom and Leela means sort of fantasy, I guess you could say. And I chose the rose and the thorn as the metaphor because you can't have one without the other. The thorn has no meaning without the rose, and the rose depends on the thorn. And at the end of it, you're left to decide who's who. That's where I made up that song, about this was actually using a bit of, if you want the background behind the actual story of the sisters, my grandfather, who was a great old gossip and knew everything that was going on. He was the Maharaja's estate manager, but he was also very social. And we were walking down the street and he said, oh, do you know that rascal? And I said, what rascal? I saw this sort of venerable middle. And he said, oh, he had an affair with his wife's sister and got her pregnant. So his wife, by then, divorce had become legal in India. So his wife made him divorce her, marry the sister, but sign over the house to him. So she lived upstairs, and the brother and his wife, lived downstairs. And same time, now I couldn't have divorce and all that happening in the period because it wasn't legal for him. So that's why I made up a different kind of story and how.
Yes, that is certainly in the novel.
Yes. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Taking a real life situation, but then bringing it back to the historical setting and what would have been possible.
Would there be a sense in which you would perhaps suggest that both characters contain the rose and the thorn? That in a sense, all of us have that ability and need that ability to be both the gentle, the sensitive, and the protective, the strong.
Yes, and that's why the father, in the very first chapter, he's talking about the two mothers of the young girl Maya, and he said, I could never decide who was the rose and who was the thorn.
Yes. Yeah. In a sense, too, that's sort of like a metaphor for even Gandhi or even India herself, where the Indian culture is so attractive and was through the 60s and 70s to a great deal of people in the West, and yet there are elements of the Indian culture that are not as attractive.
Yes. Yes, no, that's correct. We have a kind of, it's become a cliche now. One of our ministers, she was asked by a Western journalist that, do you think Western media portrays India accurately? And she said, oh yeah, whatever you say is correct, but so is its opposite. And I think that kind of sums up.
Yes. Any other questions or comments, please? So your book, Indrani, is not only in the library, but is also available on the FAWQ, the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland website, I understand.
I know it's on Amazon. I don't know about the FOC website.
It's on Amazon, did you say? Yes.
Yes. It's on Amazon. Yeah.
It is on Amazon. And
is it on Australia? Is it on
Australian Authors Marketplace?
Yes.
Is it?
So there you go.
Yes, it is. You put it there.
Oh, did I put it there? Okay. It must be on there then.
There were copies at the Avid Reader in Riverbend, but they've sold out. So I have a few copies left. It was a small print run because I didn't know how it would be received. But it's in the library.
Have you registered the PLR Indrani for that because it's in public libraries?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, good.
I was alerted to that by one of my writer friends. Yeah.
No, that's good.
Is it in schools?
That's a
public PLR's public lending right, and PLR's educational lending right.
Yeah.
Is it still at the State Library bookshop, Indrani?
I don't know. I haven't been there since COVID.
Yes, that's a problem, isn't it? We don't get to go out very much these days. We have these sorts of interactions. At least we've got this.
And there's new lockdown laws too.
Yeah.
Came into event this morning.
Yeah.
Which one?
I haven't read them yet.
Queensland.
Yeah, back to 10.
Is that right?
10 people. Yeah. Even
what, at the pub?
I don't know about that, but in your house you can't have more than 10, and outside, like outside exercise classes, you can't have more than 10.
Really?
Yeah. Like
what about this one?
I think our virtual...
It happened at 9 o'clock this morning.
I think our virtual meeting realities are going to be something we have to get used to for some time. I'm afraid. So Indrani, if I may be so bold as to suggest that you would perhaps attempt a sequel?
I've started doing the research. That's carrying on the story of the daughter. But again, I don't have all the information. I mean, I didn't quite live through that period, so and I haven't quite got a story in my head as yet. But yeah, I would like to tell the story of the daughter
Maybe she comes to Australia.
Yeah, that's the other thing. So I need to now not only research what was happening in Australia, but what was happening in, in India, but in Australia as well.
At the same time.
You're set yourself quite a task, I think. It's wonderful. Look, are there any other questions or observations? Because we have been going for now just on an hour and a half or hour and 20. If there are no other questions or comments, I'd like to.
I've
yes,
got
Jennifer, please.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for opening up your meeting, your presentation, Indrani's presentation to people who aren't members. This is the second one I attended of the Federation of Australian Writers, and they've both been just great. And I just want to say how much I appreciate it. So thank you.
Jennifer, thank you. It is our goal as the committee of the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland, and indeed one of our stated aims in our constitution, to bring writers and what they call aspiring writers together. And we define that in our committee as bringing the community of writers together, and that's everyone. And I thank you. I appreciate that, and we will always endeavour to have our general meetings in this format, or even face-to-face if we ever get there one day, open to anyone who wishes to come. So that's thank you very much. Verity, please.
Yeah, Indrani, I wanted to ask you if you feel that Indian writers write in a different structure to Western writers, because when I was teaching at university, we had some students from India, and when we were teaching them how to write essays, they wrote in a very different style to our Western style. I was just wondering how much you've noticed that with the different writing styles of structure, even for books, not just essays, but even for books with that.
I think it depends on the kind of education they've had.
Yeah.
What kind of schools they went to, because that really sets. I went to convent schools, so we had to learn the Queen's English, and I wouldn't be able to tell if I'm writing in a different way to a Western, well, English speaking. People are often thinking in their first language and then putting that in English on the page.
I was thinking about like the structure of a novel, though. I started talking about essays, but now with structures of novels, do you think that novels written in Indian languages are written in a different structure to English written novels?
It depends on which English, and a lot of Indians also write in English.
Yeah.
But they will be bringing in the influence. Do you have any particular one in mind?
No, I was just wondering if you had noticed anything that was...
The dialogue is, of course, what you notice, and then maybe the way they describe things. But again, as I said, it depends on what kind of education they have. So if you kind of read the newspapers like the Times of India, it doesn't read that differently from the Australian, because it's that group of people.
Yeah, it was hard. It was just hard to explain like paragraph writing and that sort of thing. We've got such a specific structure to write an essay and paragraphs and introductions and conclusions and all that sort of stuff, and they seem to want to write it in a different way. So that's what I was just asking about.
Because we were definitely had to learn about paragraphs and clauses, and we had to do something called parsing, which I think I would feel I had to do it.
Analysis and parsing.
Huh? Yeah.
Analysis and parsing.
Please don't remind me.
I remember it well.
And keeping in mind, I went to school a long time back, so things might have changed even in the schools I went to. So.
I'm not so sure. Yes. Look, are there any other questions, please? Because what I would like to do very much is thank Indrani. Sorry.
I'd like to thank everyone for their patience, and sorry, Verity, I probably didn't answer your question very well.
No, it was just if there was something obvious to you, but if it's not obvious to you, then that's
No,
okay.
I noticed the difference depending on what kind of schools they've been to.
Yeah. That's probably what it is.
Yeah.
Thanks, Indrani.
Look, before I formally close the meeting and thank Indrani, I just wanted to share this particular slide with you, this particular piece. Our next event for the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland is actually a face-to-face event. It will be held at USC Moreton Bay. It'll be held on Saturday the 10th of October, and Indrani is one of the people who will be on the panel. It is a panel for our contribution to Mental Health Week, Queensland, and it's called Creativity Building Resilience. And the other panelists, besides Dr. Indrani Ganguly, will be Jodie Lane, who has written the Turning Points Time Travel Adventure series, Riley Webb, a young Year 11 student who has developed a journaling app, a young man by the name of Anthony Hanna, who's an ex-Victoria Police critical incident response negotiator and an author of his memoir, and Associate Professor Sandy O'Sullivan from the USC Creative Industries, who is an Indigenous person from the Wiradjuri Nation, and she has recently received a Australian Research Council Future Fellow grant for the next 4 years to examine creative practice and its impact on Indigenous wellbeing. If you go onto this site, which is our Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland website, you'll see the events, and if you click on join the guest list that you can see here, you'll be registered as part of the audience. We have to restrict that audience to 80 people due to current restrictions. It will be in the auditorium at the new University Foundation building at Petrie Railway Station, right next to Petrie Railway Station, on Saturday afternoon, 10th of October from 2 p.m. till 4 p.m. And we are very much looking forward to that. And thank you, Indrani, for also being part of that particular panel as well.
Magnificent venue.
It certainly is. For those of you who ever get the opportunity to go out and visit the new foundation building at USC Moreton Bay, it is well worth the visit. All of you will get the opportunity, in fact, next year on the first weekend in July 2021, when we will be holding our inaugural Readers and Writers Festival at that very place. And we are certainly developing that as we speak, and it's hopefully we already have in excess of 30 authors, more than 90% of them from Southeast Queensland, who have already committed to being presenters at that particular festival. And my thanks to the team who are putting that together. It's absolutely wonderful. So, Indrani, thank you very, very much. Thank you to your contribution to today. It's fascinating. We've, I think, enjoyed it and learned a great deal. So, could we all
Thanks to everyone for taking time off on a Saturday afternoon.
Indeed, and thank you to all of our participants today. Thank you very, very much. The video of this particular event will be edited and taking out some of the extraneous stuff and cutting down what I say all the time, I suppose. So thank you very much, and we hope you're able to join us again, hopefully face-to-face next time.